Welcome everyone to today's discussion. This discussion is on not our week's theme exactly, which is the vision of fathers, but someone who in the Greeks' eyes was something of a father to humanity, and that is Prometheus. Prometheus Construction is the name that we chose for our company, the heroism that the name represented, and also the foresight that it represented. When choosing a board of directors, we very deliberately chose someone who has a great deal of foresight to be on that board, and that's Dr. Jim Tepfer. So he seems like to be a wonderful representative of the subject under consideration. So the Promethean vision. Jim, can I ask you to take us away?
Okay, all right. Thank you, Renee. I've retitled this Prometheus, the myth of Prometheus, wisdom and self-sacrifice. It seemed to me in our culture, worldwide even, if there was even a drop more of wisdom and an ounce more of self-sacrifice by our leaders in various countries, what a better world it would be, and how much we could benefit from a little wisdom and a little selflessness and action. And the myth of Prometheus is very wonderful in terms of making this quality clear. It goes back, of course, to the ancient Greeks, taking us way back in terms not only of time, but really in terms of our way of looking at the world and responding to the world. The myth is really of unknown origin, although there are various versions of it in different Greek, but its origin is actually something of a mystery. Perhaps the finest spiritual account of it, of its meaning, of its symbolism, is found in Aeschylus, the great Greek playwright, in his Prometheus Bound. And then later on, it's even expanded and deepened by H.P. Blavatsky in the 19th century, the founder of the modern phase of the Theosophical movement. So it does have some very deep, extensive meaning, spiritually and intellectually and otherwise. To turn to the myth itself, the main people in the myth are really Prometheus, who is a Titan, Zeus, who is the king of the gods and goddesses of Mount Olympus. And the third protagonist in the background is you and I, mankind. However, it's mankind at that point in his development in which he is really quite without knowledge and without civilization. So this is incipient mankind, you might say. Nonetheless, these are the three main people involved in the myth. And just so you're clear, both Prometheus, a Titan, a member of the previous race of gods, is immortal. He's a god. He's immortal. He's indestructible. And furthermore, Zeus also is immortal, as are all the gods and goddesses who reside on Mount Olympus. Mankind resides in the foothills around Mount Olympus, and then specifically here in Arcadia. These are the main beings in this. Now, our interest in understanding the potential levels of meaning within this myth, to some degree, as Renee indicated, are present in the very name itself. It's very intriguing, very interesting that Prometheus refers to the fire bringer, the light bringer, he who has foreknowledge, forethought. It also seems to mean the luminous seer, S-E-E-R, like an illuminated seer in the Hindu tradition. This points really to the fact that the myth probably has something to do with the awakening of mind, with the acquisition of knowledge, with the possibility for civilization, and finally, and even more deeply, to the awakening of wisdom and immortality. I came across something interesting about wisdom. King Solomon was asked, what is wisdom? Who's the wise man? And he says, the wise man is he who sees that which is yet unborn. So wisdom has perceptive powers to see deeper levels of cause and what's going to unfold. This is why Prometheus is referred to as the being of great foreknowledge, of great insight, forward-looking, of visionary. Now, what about the myth specifically? The myth opens with, we're on Mount Olympus, up in the palace of the gods and the goddesses, and they are celebrating. They have won a tremendous victory over the Titans, the previous rulers, of which Prometheus was one. But he, realizing that the time had come for the Titans race to give way to the new rebellious gods and goddesses from Mount Olympus, he ended up cooperating with Zeus and helping him win the battle with the Titans. But Prometheus, being the incredible golden-hearted Titan, he made sure that Zeus and the new rebel gods and goddesses of Mount Olympus did not punish the previous Titans, particularly Kronos, who was the ruler. In fact, they ended up being banished to an island that is mysteriously exists to this day, and it's said to be in a perpetual state of a golden age. So somewhere there's an island of gods and goddesses who are in a perpetual state of bliss and wonderful relationships with each other. Nonetheless, Prometheus is now dwelling with the new gods and goddesses, and particularly with Zeus, the king. Zeus notices that Prometheus, for some reason unknown to him, leaves periodically these wonderful banquets of the gods. Good heavens, they're marvelous. All the muses are there with their arts and their marvelous voices and their instruments, and there's dancing and there's mead and there's ambrosia, and there's all kind of incredible harmonics, tremendous laughter and mirth and joy. But for some reason, the great counselor Prometheus, who's beloved by all because he's so generous, he keeps leaving the banquets. Now, Zeus, although he respects Prometheus, begins to have questions, wondering, doubts, suspicions. So he went, why does he leave? What's the problem? Why would anyone leave this kind of occasion? This is what, brings tremendous joy to all the gods and goddesses. So finally, he decides that whenever he asks Prometheus just kind of brushes him off. Oh, nothing, just something I want to do. I have more interest there, etc. So finally, Zeus says, okay, I'm going to call the god Hermes. Hermes has sandal feet that has wings on them. So Hermes is quick. He connects the celestial and the terrestrial. He connects the top of the mountain to the plains where human beings and mortals dwell, because human beings are mortals. He says to Hermes, look, go down, follow Prometheus the next time he leaves, see what he's doing, and come back and let me know. So Hermes laughs about it. He's a very jovial, very light-footed, light-hearted, golden Hermes. And so he says, yes, of course he must, because Zeus is the king of the gods. And so he does. He follows Prometheus and later reports back to Zeus. And he says, O king of the gods, there's nothing to worry about. Prometheus, he's down among the puny mortals. He seems to be a helper. They regard him as a great friend. Ah, says Zeus, I see. Why? Why would he dwell with such flawed beings? Puny, incapable of much. I have to ask him myself. And so the next time he sees Prometheus, he calls him and says, Prometheus, I know what you've been doing. Really, says Prometheus. And what is that? You're spending time with all these mortals, this race. Why? He said, because they're in great distress. They are blind, basically. They have no real knowledge. They wander. They're aimless. They're full of fears. They have no law. They have no civilization. They're pretty much dreadful. And I feel for their condition. And it bothers me. And so I have tried to befriend them. And then he thinks to himself, ah, ha, ha, ha. Prometheus, I know how clever he is. I know Prometheus has great powers of visualization and foresight. He must be up to something. See, Zeus's mind already is beginning to feed on doubt, already beginning to feed on suspicion. Even though he has all this power and he has this tremendous thing called the thunderbolt, which no one can resist. So what does he do? He begins to think, I know what he's after. He's after something very holy. He's after the thrice sacred fire that it resides in Mount Olympus. Now, that's something immortals on earth can never have. I don't want them having this sacred fire. Why? Because if they have this sacred fire, they're in the position of gaining knowledge. And furthermore, the kind of knowledge that are secretly in this fire would make it capable of them to become wise and immortal. If that's the case, they become a challenge. They become possibly usurpers. They could conceivably overpower the gods. Us. That I can't allow to happen. Not at all. So that night at the banquet, Zeus calls for attention and he tells everyone, listen carefully. If any god or goddess steals any of the thrice sacred fire and takes it to earth to mortals, I assure you, you will receive punishment that you will regret you ever incurred. I cannot kill you because you're immortal, but I can make you suffer greatly. It was quiet. Everyone was puzzled. Who's Zeus talking to? And so they all went on with their banquet. Prometheus knew, because he sees things as they unfold. And so he went down and to Arcadia, and he spoke to his brother, Epimetheus. Not Prometheus, Epimetheus. Epimetheus is he who sees after the fact. He who learns only by looking backward. He doesn't look forward. He doesn't realize the potential consequences of the decisions he makes. He only discovers them when he looks back later. So he's the opposite of Prometheus, who sees things more deeply and sees the possible consequences and assumes responsibility. So he tells Epimetheus, I want to tell you something. At some point, Zeus is going to appear to you. And when he does, he's going to offer you a gift. I'm telling you right now, brother, don't accept the gift. All right, says Epimetheus. I won't, brother. I won't. Good. And so then Prometheus proceeds to do what he's going to do. Sure enough, later in the day, Zeus looks from the tremendous palaces of the gods, and he sees what? He sees smoke rising from amongst the trees in the plains. And he knows right away what has happened. Human beings have been brought fire. Don't forget, fire symbolizes something. Don't forget, to Prometheus, what is so desperate about human beings is their mental darkness and their incapacity to regulate themselves and live by, and live according to a higher consideration. At any rate, so what does he do? He sends to Prometheus 2 giants who are heartless, and together with Hephaestus. And Hephaestus is the great smith who molds and shapes and makes many things. And basically what happens, they take Prometheus to Mount Caucasus, which is on the outskirts of the world. The wind blows continuously on this mountain. It is hot during the day. It is freezing cold at night. They take Prometheus to the top of the mountain. They shackle him there. His legs, his feet, even his neck is shackled. He cannot move. Furthermore, when he's left there, he hears the screeching and the howling of the wind. And every night, evening, an eagle comes flying by, swoops down and tears out his liver. And then during the night, because he's a god, his body heals itself. And for a brief moment when the sun rises, he has a moment of peace, of the transition from night and bitter cold to the coming of the tremendous heat. So this is his fate, and he knows his fate. He anticipated his fate, and he accepts his fate, but it is an agonizing fate. Now, what is interesting is Zeus is not satisfied. Prometheus is noble of heart, great, wise, but he wants him to suffer more, because now that mortals have this fire, this wisdom, this possibility of becoming a civilization, he wants Prometheus to suffer more. He could at this point use his thunderbolt to kill humanity, because even though they've been given fire, they don't yet have the knowledge that's contained within that fire. But he decides something different. What will make Prometheus suffer the most will be to see humanity suffer. If he can make humanity suffer, not by obliterating them, by giving them something else to make them suffer. So what does he do? He calls Hephaestus to him again and asks him to build a shape of a certain kind. And Hephaestus says, that's what you're asking me to do, is to design a female. We have them among the gods, you know. And so he said, yes, do that. So he comes back and he brings back to Zeus this absolutely exquisite, elegant, beautiful woman who has sparkling eyes of innocence. She is innocent. And then Zeus introduces her to all the gods and goddesses and says, now, what I want you to do is give her gifts. Each of you give her some gift of some quality that you have. So she was given beauty, she was given courage, she was given all these marvelous qualities. And that's why she became called Pandora, because Pandora means all gifted. So she received all these gifts. And then, as we know, she was taken to earth by Zeus. He goes to Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus, and he says, you know, I'm terribly sorry about what I had to do to your brother, but I want you to know, for you, I have respect and appreciation. And as a gift to you, I give you Pandora as your wife. Well, when he looks at her, she's so sweet and innocent and radiates a goodness. He's just struck by her. And he thanks Zeus immediately, spontaneously. He says, yes, I'll take her for wife. And he said, and Zeus says, now, one other thing, in addition to her, I have a treasure chest as your wedding gift. So please feel free to enjoy all the wealth and all the wonder that is in that treasure chest. And so Epimetheus accepts it. As soon as Zeus leaves, it dawns on Epimetheus, he was warned by Prometheus not to accept a gift from Zeus. Nonetheless, he had. Now, you cannot return a gift given to you by a god. And by the way, one of the problems Zeus has is, because Prometheus gave fire to humanity, he could not take the gift away. You cannot take away a gift given by a god, and a god cannot give back a gift that he's received from a god. So now Prometheus was stuck. he has two gifts which he was not supposed to accept, and now he has. And he then turns to Pandora and says, look, you're innocent of this, you don't understand this, but I am telling you right now, I'm ordering you. You may not open that treasure chest. However, the treasure chest was so beguiling, so seductive, that even Prometheus couldn't just take the chest and throw it away. He couldn't bring himself to do it. So he just told her, you can never open that chest. And she was being a very obedient wife, very willing, said, all right, fine, I won't do that at all. So they put it away. Well, of course, we know time passes. And with the passage of time, curiosity begins to arise in Pandora. And curiosity intensifies. And then on a full moon night, she goes into the room where the treasure chest has been stored. And I'm only going to take a peek, just a little peek. I've got to see what's in there. After all, it's a gift from Zeus. And so she peeks, and about that time, Prometheus has heard her come behind her, but before he can say anything to her, she's opened it just a little. And when she does, it flies open with tremendous violence. And out of it comes all of these fairies and creatures of various kinds. And they're all dark. They represent ills, ill will, bitterness, anger, lust, all kinds of things that sweep and swirl around Earth and infect humanity. So Zeus' revenge is, yes, Prometheus gave us reason, the capacity for knowledge, the ability to choose and build civilizations that are marvelous. But at the same time, he infuses into the world all of these ills. And Prometheus is distraught. And he looks at Pandora and says, I don't blame you. I don't fault you at all. This is my fault for not having listened to what Prometheus said. And then suddenly they heard a little noise, and out crawls another little creature, but this one is bright. It's hope. So hope then comes out, and that becomes the basis for why human beings, no matter how difficult things get, even this time that we live in now, even then, there's a wellspring of hope buried in the human heart that is absolutely indestructible. All a person has to do is recognize it and persist. So that's a little bit of the thing. Now, there are lots of interesting questions we can raise there, not the least of which is about fire. But anyway, so I'll leave it there for our, that's the myth of Prometheus, integrating different myths into one. If you have any thoughts or questions, comments, whatever, be fine.
I wonder why Prometheus, with his ability to see ahead, didn't see it coming that his brother would mess up there. That's
a very good question, David. A very good question. I can only assume, I mean, it's up to discussion, I suppose, but I can only assume that he would know that that was the nature of Prometheus, and highly likely, and he would know the nature of Zeus as well. But that is one of the interesting things about beings who have any kind of perceptive insight and power about other human beings. They still have to do their duty, even if they know what's going to happen. See, that shows you why being good isn't enough. When you really have knowledge of any kind and you're responsible, you have to take the suffering that comes with it, and you still have to do what you have to do. He still had to tell Prometheus, he still had to give him his chance, he still had to do what was the best he could do. Isn't that what everyone has to do sometime? You go and you talk to your teenage son about something he's been doing for a long time, and you know probably he's not going to listen to what you say, even though you can point out to him why he should. But you don't just say, well, I'm just not going to talk to him. I'm just going to let him do what he's going to do, but without any fatherly advice, without any good wishes or whatever. So you still have to do it.
Well, along those lines then,
Yeah.
it's as though he saw that the suffering of man was a necessity for man's growth.
Correct. Good point. Most learning comes from suffering. The philosopher Unamuno said that most people don't really raise questions that are important enough to make a difference in their lives until they've suffered. When we're feeling good, everything's going fine, we usually don't question anything. We aren't even so much aware of other people's suffering because we're in such a good romantic state or exalted state or whatever it happens to be, intoxicated by love or power or influence or success, whatever. But it's when we fail, we make mistakes and we discover them, when we suffer or see others suffer that we love or care about, that we begin to ask questions. And that can lead to discovery. I have a question for you all. What is fire? Where does it come from? One of the four elements, right? Elementary, my dear Watson. You know, one of the four elements, correct? Okay.
The element of transformation.
I'm sorry, what?
The element of transformation.
Okay, so you're saying one of the qualities of fire is, right?
Yeah.
It's one of the characteristics of fire is that it transforms something from one condition to another, correct? A tree, when it's burning, is changing its nature and its whole chemistry is being changed. It's a Shiva function of the god of destruction that has to destroy before there can be new life. Yes. Where fire comes from, we don't really, it's odd. You can strike two rocks together and you get a spark. Two inanimate things like rocks, when you strike them together, you get something electric. It's sitting there in potentia, right? It's very interesting, fire, where it comes from. But, so now you mentioned that it transforms things. What else does fire do?
Illuminate.
Just think of it. What? No one from Santa Barbara. Sorry, you're excluded from Santa Barbara. So anyone else? This is so. Our former Santa Barbans. So, fire. Just take it simply, right? Fire transforms. What else does fire do? If you're in the forest and it's late at night, why do you desire a fire?
It provides light and also heat.
Ah, correct. Yes. Yes, true. It provides light. It illuminates. It makes what's not visible visible, right? It makes the invisible visible. It gives you also warmth. It gives warmth. And it radiates warmth. Yes. So we have three characteristics of fire. Take that at the mental level. When a child goes into an adult, doesn't its faculty of reason and imagination and memory and feeling all change? Don't they? You're incarnating the mind, right? A 3-year-old doesn't have a mind the way a 12-year-old does, correct? Children love to learn. They love to gather light. That is a wonderful thing. But what else is there about fire besides the fact that it provides light, warmth, and is transformational? It's unique to being a fire, unique among all the elements.
Well, very important in our evolution was that it also kept the wild animals away from us and it protected us.
So it provided protection. That's true. It's interesting. Why is it that animals are afraid of fire? It's always been an interesting phenomenon. I mean, even a lion and a tiger, when they would love to consume you for a meal, if you had a torch with fire on it, it frightens them. They're responding to the symbolism of it more than we are, perhaps. But it is true. It's true. So, nothing else about fire? By the way, I used to ask this question in my philosophy classes for decades. And only one student over 20 years came up with the answer about what is there about fire that makes it unique, besides the characteristics that we mentioned. And
Burns and destroys.
I'm sorry, what?
It burns and destroys.
Okay, it burns and destroys. Yes, that's true. That's something related to what David was saying about transforming, because fire, interestingly, fire can only exist when it's consuming something. It needs continuous fuel. But also notice too, that one of the great philosophers mentioned why everything is changing. When you look at fire, you see something that is in continual flux. It's the same, but it's in continual flux. Its form is continually dynamic. Now, one of the interesting things is that fire, it's like this. If I were to hold a torch that was lit, and all of you had torches that were unlit, right? And each of you came up and lit your torch from my torch, correct? This could go on infinitely because the torch that I'm holding doesn't diminish because I light up another torch. So it has the possibility of infinite infinite use without diminishing its original content. So fire can spread without diminishing the original. So where you had a room with one light, you could have a room with 50 lights. And it doesn't take away from the original mass of fire. I think that's an interesting idea. Look at the analog. What is the analog then on the mind, at the level of the mind? Does fire have anything to do with understanding the human mind?
Ideas.
Ideas.
Ideas are somewhat viral, right?
Ideas? Do ideas illuminate? If you change your idea, do you change your understanding of the world? You bet you do. Emerson said, just, someone can be as sturdy and as stern looking as they might be, but if they change their idea, you can change the whole personality. If you give them an idea that they can accept. A revolution begins with one idea. It can light up an entire country with one fundamental change in an idea, just as you had the idea of representative democracy, which was nothing common about it at all at that time at all in history. That was an idea that when it took root, changed the whole outlook of massive human beings. And that was not easy because they had to throw off a whole nother superstructure that they had accepted for a long time. But an idea is really something that illuminates. Can ideas be relevant to the passions? What about love? Is love a beautiful flame that burns a cool flame, a warm flame? Love, it was mentioned that, fire generates warmth. Love generates warmth. Can fire be destructive? Can love be destructive? Is there anger? See, there are all kinds of parallels that what Prometheus is doing is talking about something at another level entirely. Does science know of any evolutionary moment when there is self-consciousness? No, it doesn't. It's now finally accepted the fact of consciousness. It's one of the hard facts of science now that there is consciousness. They can't explain it, but they have it. But self-awareness too. When Prometheus brings fire, he's bringing mind. He's bringing awareness. He's bringing the capacity to reason and to learn and to generate principles that build a civilization. I think it's just very interesting that we don't have such a concept very readily. To me, it's the knowledge and responsibility ratio is the big thing in America for public figures. We have a lot of rationalization, but not much reasoning. Our heart.
One thing, Jim,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
vacation. That somehow fire doesn't always destroy completely, but purifies. Could you say a little bit more about that?
That's a very interesting point. Fire can actually also heal wounds, but fire is often equated with spirit. It's often equated with mind. It's also equated with purification. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And suffering usually is a form of purification. There can be self-purification for what we learned last week from Bina about self-mastery. There has to be tapas. If you're committed to something like Prometheus was, and you also understand the implications for you and for others of your actions, there's going to be suffering, and that can be purifying. Martin Luther King Jr. says it's redemptive. If you suffer for justice, it's redemptive, not for you, but it's redemptive for everyone. You're helping to burn off a whole lot of historical accretions and problems that have existed for a long time. People end up feeling freer afterwards. It's like when you go through a fever and you finally come out of it, you can feel a whole lot better. It purifies you, a fever does. We don't generally think of it that way, but illness is a way of reestablishing harmony. That was the Pythagorean and also the Hippocratic view. Hippocrates said, what is illness? Illness is disharmony within the human system, and is connected with the mind as well. When there's an imbalance between mind and body, you have disharmony, and people end up living bad lifestyles, and they end up creating them illnesses for themselves. See, I think sometimes we have suffering in a rather grim way. I don't think so. I think when a mother is helping a child and she suffers for, quote, suffers for doing it, in the sense of all the effort, all the time put in, and you don't, and when she does it, there's an element of satisfaction and that you're helping someone and that you're giving them new opportunities. So suffering is not necessarily a negative thing. It's a purificatory, and it's also gives you strength. People who come through suffering are much stronger than when they began, if they come through it and they don't whine.
So Jim, here, I'm wondering about the mystery of fire. Fire, it's ubiquitous. It's all around us, but it's invisible almost all the time.
Yeah.
Until it has that element has the right ingredients to bring it into
True. Yeah.
the physical world, but it's always there. And this whole idea of Solomon's thing about a wise person is able to see that which is unborn or something like
Yes,
that.
that's what King Solomon said, yes.
Yeah, and then this idea of Prometheus, his main attribute is foresight. And you have this idea also of, what's the quote that without vision, the people perish. This idea of this mysterious kind of vision or this mysterious kind of foresight, it seems like it's drawing into the realm of potential, just like fire is in the realm of potential, but then it has to be brought into the actual world. Can you say something about the relationship of potentiality to actuality?
That's a very interesting question, Cliff. Potentiality to actuality. What separates real leaders from those who are not quite so effective? First of all, you would think you would have to have a belief in potentiality. How could you couldn't actualize something you didn't believe to be true. If you don't believe in the potential of your child who's having challenges in their relationships and in his or her life, if you don't believe in the potential of the child to work through that or to change and to grow, how could you help them actualize it? So you have to have an abiding faith in whatever it is you're trying to bring into, give birth to in the world. Socrates was said to be a midwife. Why? Because he was helping people to see things differently and to give birth to a richer perspective that allowed them to have faith and confidence in themselves as souls. That's what he says. You're not simply your body. You're not your personal characteristics. You cannot be reduced to your circumstances entirely. Human beings have a tremendous spiritual reserve, but they have to activate it through a faith in certain ideas and ideals. And as Lamartine said, ideals are only truth, but at a distance. And so if you have that vision of truth, your firm belief and conviction in certain things that you feel and believe to be good, and on the basis of that, you try to visualize for the future by acting now in little ways for a better tomorrow, moving closer to the actualization of your beliefs. When you do that and you make a commitment, because that's the main thing drawn from Gandhi last week, vows and commitments. If you commit yourself to your beliefs being put into practice, in time, their power, their revelatory power and their kinetic power begins to have an influence. And you begin to transform everything around you, including yourself. So the connection between the potential and the actual has to do with both clarity of understanding of the potential, what you can't see but know to be true, and then you make a commitment to it, and then you visualize the ways in which you can bring it into the world in very simple, elementary ways, without a lot of fuss, without a lot of drama, without a lot of drum beating, but just trying to go about it quietly and effectively as you can, and be like Prometheus, be willing to take what comes, knowing that what you're doing is right.
There's a notion that there's a bit of consciousness in everything.
Yes,
And when things begin to collect into more condensed forms, such as the prefrontal cortex, the most densely ramified bit of matter in the known universe, is we have a level of consciousness that we recognize what we call consciousness. In yoga, we talk about abhyasa, or repetition. And if you have an idea and you work and persistently and with patience and perseverance, the I Ching talks a lot about perseverance. You're collecting that energy, that consciousness of it, and bringing it to that threshold where it can, I think, then manifest. So there's this notion of a threshold, like when we're rubbing two pieces of wood together, it's generating heat, but at one point, something catalyzes and it creates a new reaction. So there's a threshold that something passes before transformation.
that's beautiful. That's a wonderful image. I think that makes a lot of sense. Thresholds. What is involved in crossing a threshold? Remember they used to, in other cultures, they would have the period in which movement from childhood to manhood or womanhood. You went through your trials, there were certain enactments of trials to help someone make the transition, crossing a threshold from being a child, quote, a child, or a young person, to being an adult member of a community, of a tribe, or whatever. So that they had social ways of enacting that whole thing you're talking about, which is more internal and psychological. But yes, I think that's very beautiful. I just wasn't aware of how that was put in terms of yoga, in terms of the way you put it, but I think I can understand what you're saying.
Repetition. Practice makes perfect. I wonder, Jim, I took a mycology class, and in one of the sessions we talked about a Greek elixir that was used during celebrations. I think it was called soma.
Oh, yes.
Are you familiar with soma?
Well, yes, I am familiar with soma through the Hindu tradition. But you're talking about through the Greeks?
From the Greeks, yeah. There was a beverage that they may not be called, it's something different in the Greek.
Well, it could have been connected with Dionysius, yes.
there's a book from about 2 years ago called Stealing Fire, and it's about the Promethean legend, and it's about something that the Greeks were consuming that were taking them into these altered states where they would have these revelatory moments, and then being able to see forward as the shaman of the Amazon, for example, and all the shamans around the planet.
You see, that I don't doubt that there whatsoever that there could well have been true. Just to say, sometimes say that the priestess at the temple of Apollo, who was able to listen to a question, and then if she answered you, she was saying something that was meaningful and specific toward you that you had to unravel yourself. It was prophetic, but you had to be the one to unravel it. But I've read of explanations where they say, well, she had her tripod, where she was sitting was over a certain kind of opening from which certain gases arose and it intoxicated her, et cetera, et cetera. But that can be true, but it doesn't deny the fact that there are other ways of experiencing those altered states that have nothing to do with externals and has everything to do with internal striving and effort along a path. The Orphics had the notion of ecstasy. Ecstasy was not what we call ecstasy in terms of a drug or even a static state. Ecstasy meant stepping out of your conventional state of mind by a discipline that allowed you to experience a subtler state of mind which is present, but you're not aware of it, because you have to kind of cross, as you said, the threshold in order to become aware of that, and you can't do it cheaply. You have to earn it. So that's why discipline's involved. That's why someone like the Dalai Lama can get so frustrated when he's talking with scientists, not scientists, but people who are materialists. What do you think, 2,500 years of Buddhist practicing were all fools? You know, and they went into meditative states that you think were all generated by brain stimulation. We have no knowledge whatsoever that it's all being done. You know, it's absurd. People don't spend lifetimes in monasteries like that under a discipline without having some experience of something that they can tally together, compare together, and forward into the future for people to use. So yes, Soma could be physicalized like that, but it's much more. Soma is also a richer concept of releasing something inside the human mind and human heart that brings about a slow transmutation.
Jim, I was intrigued by some of your conversation of suffering. And then when David spoke of this threshold, was I understanding that you might be suggesting from what Dr. Martin Luther King said about unearned suffering being redemptive, or
yes,
suffering on
but no, unearned suffering is redemptive, yes.
Yeah. So one can not only like go through a fever in one's own illness and have that break the virus or whatever it is finally, but also one could suffer on behalf of a larger whole and cause a transformation on behalf of that whole.
Very well put. I think that's a very good point. I used to puzzle a lot about King's statement, unearned suffering is redemptive, until it finally occurred to me that he wasn't speaking about the person suffering. That unearned suffering is meaning, yes, it might be unearned in the sense that you're being the ones being treated unjustly, but if you are trying to combat injustice and you're suffering for it, the cause for which you are suffering is going to be redemptive for everyone. And even the person doing the harm in time could come to discover that they're doing harm and cease to do it. So it's redemptive potentially to everyone. It's not the person who's committed to principles that are good or not truthful and nonviolent is concerned with the welfare of the whole. So that would be definitely the case of one way of looking. Look at what happens when some of these doctors and nurses here now in America, as well as elsewhere, when they go into places where there are plagues, where there's real danger, they risk getting the illness. I remember Gandhi talking about there was a plague in Bombay, and he was very worried about it. And so he went and spoke to several of people that he knew, and this also happened in South Africa. And he said, we've got to go in. There are nurses and doctors there, but they need help. I know you have families, I know you have this, but someone should be willing to go in with me, because I am certainly going to go and assist the doctors and the nurses. These are our fellow human beings. We shouldn't just let the doctors and the nurses be the only ones. Although strangely enough, doctors and nurses, when they go to these places, they rarely get the disease. That's always an interesting phenomenon. How is it that doctors and nurses, for the most part, don't get these things? Is there something protective that nature provides? When people have pure motive and they act on it unconditionally, because that's the Hippocratic Oath. It's an unconditional resolve that you're going to use your knowledge to relieve the suffering of anyone. Whether you like them, don't like them, it doesn't matter. Your responsibility is there. And when you do it, it brings its own protection, its own strength. And so, but anyway, he decided to appeal to people, and he got like 20 volunteers who had families, men who volunteered to go in with them, and they went in and they didn't lose a single person in the plague, although I heard that one nurse got ill and died. But all the other nurses and the doctors, they managed until it all burned itself out. But their example helped the people that were suffering. It helped the relatives of the people that were suffering. So they took on something that wasn't theirs, quote unquote, and it made a difference. It also made them stronger, because you can bet some of them were afraid, but they made themselves do it. Like I like to quote John Wayne, you know, the Duke, who said, "Courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway." So I mean, that's what people do. They put themselves in the fire.
Whew. Amazing. Does anyone want to ask a final question or make a final comment? This session
Yes.
seems as though it's just galloped along. We've actually come to our hour. Is that Edward?
Yes, it is. I just had a quick question for your speaker. Did we broach the answer to his question some 20 minutes ago? All the participants had opinions of his definition of what is the unique quality of fire that only one student in 20 years.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We did say something about it, but I might have been unclear. The unique quality of fire is that it can be shared without diminishing it. So if you're holding a torch with a lit flame, you can light up 1,000 and it doesn't subtract from your initial flame. So it continues to replicate itself and infinitely.
And that sets it apart from everything else.
Yes, that sets it apart from the other elements. Other three elements, yeah.
Of the others.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And that also shows you why what education is about. It's about sharing knowledge, right? The more you share knowledge as an instructor, you don't lose anything, you gain. The more you as a mother or father share with your children your insights, your understanding, your appreciation, your values, you don't diminish yourself, you enhance your understanding, you enhance your strength. Your fire burns brighter, it doesn't diminish it at all. So sharing knowledge, sharing insight, sharing understanding does nothing more than make everyone brighter. See, so that's the beauty of it. If you look at fire in terms of ideas or knowledge.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jim.
Sure, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Does somebody want to give Jim a formal vote of thanks?
Oh, I'll give it a shot. First of all, you know, I've heard this myth many dozens of times, read it in books and so on. I've never heard it explained in this way. And to me, it just filled in, a whole a Pandora's box of detail that and connections with, you know, all the aspects of human nature, human and divine, that I hadn't made those connections with the myth before. So I'm very appreciative of that. And then, you know, this whole kind of investigation that Jim took us through, you know, step by step, and looking at the element of fire and seeing the analogies to the light of the mind. That also is not something I've ever heard before. And and the responses to the questions just seem to keep, you know, unfolding you could say, the significance of the myth, of the deeper meanings of the myth, the allegory of the myth to our lives, our daily lives, in so many ways, in so many meaningful ways. So I'm for one, am very grateful, Jim. Thanks.
Thank you, Kurt. I appreciate that.
Thank you most wholeheartedly, Jim, for that wonderful journey that you took us through to understand the myth of Prometheus.
Well, I enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you.
I'd like to let everyone know about next week's topic, the week of the Eightfold Path Right Speech. We have the good fortune of having our kumuhula, our hula master, who happens to be Mary's, who's with us right now, Mary's daughter, Malia, speaking to us next week on Ika Olelo no Ke Ola. And that translates from Hawaiian into, in the language, there is life. So speaking from the Hawaiian tradition, she'll be talking about how there's life in language, in the word.